long before. These same emotional centers are also designed to be the brain's alarm system. They warn us of any threat to survival. Now, in prehistory, they probably had the job of answering the one key question for survival. Can you guess what that is? It's got to be something like, do I eat it or does it eat me, right? Now, think about it. This is not a question you want to sit around and mull over. You're not going to like look it up on the internet. Because if you did, if you waited, it just ate you, and you didn't pass on your genes to us, your designer brain. So our ancient ancestors had really quick answers to do I eat it or does it eat me? They knew right away, or they didn't survive. So in the modern brain, these same emotional centers are able to take over the rest of the brain in a single moment, because in ancient times it was necessary for survival. Now, if there's an emergency, this decision that we got to do something quick is made largely by a structure called the amygdala. Amygdala means almond in Greek. It's an almond-shaped structure. And the key thing about it is this is where the emotional part of a memory is stored. You know, the brain stores different parts of a memory in different places. The emotional part is here. So everything that ever happened to us that made us angry, made us scared, made us really happy is remembered in the amygdala. About 5 years ago, a neuroscientist at New York University, Joseph Ledoux, discovered what amounts to a dirty back alley in the brain. It's a 1 neuron long connection between the thalamus and the amygdala. Now, 1 neuron long is tiny and it's very quick. So this circuit allows the amygdala, our emotional memories, to scan everything happening to us from moment to moment to moment to see if something happening now is anything like something that happened then that made us really angry or scared or happy, right? Now, if it gets a match, like there's something that was scary, something that happened then that's scary, it triggers what's called an amygdala hijack. It takes over the rest of the brain because it's an emergency. The signs of an amygdala hijack are 3. First, you have a really quick, sudden reaction. Second, it's a very strong emotion. And third, when the dust settles, you realize you just did something really inappropriate. Whoops, why did I say that? I wish I hadn't done that. I'm sure it's never happened to you folks. Did happen to me once in a while, I'll confess. In fact, by the end of our program, I'll share with you some ways that you can prevent amygdala hijacks. It's a very useful skill, I assure you. One key point. The amygdala learns its repertoire largely in childhood, and it thinks in a kind of childlike way. So you might get an amygdala hijack that's something like this. This guy is making me so mad, I'd like to slug him, right? It's just like a little kid. Now, the good news is that impulse goes from the amygdala up to the prefrontal lobe, just behind the forehead. Now, this is the brain's executive center. This is where we bring it all together. This is where we make our decisions. Brings together info from all parts of the brain, then decides what to do. So at that point, the prefrontal lobe might add one crucial piece of information. Oh, this is your boss. Oh, whoops. So we'll smile and change the subject, right? You know, you're not going to, okay. So you see, there are neurons in the prefrontal areas that receive these emotional impulses from the amygdala, and they have the power to refuse to go along. These are inhibitory neurons are called. They're just say no neurons. This is where that response is in the brain. Just say no. If they don't work well, the results can be disastrous. Do you remember that boxing match with Mike Tyson and Evander Holyfield? I mean, who could forget it, right? So he took a bite out of Holyfield's ear. I mean, Tyson said in an interview, I just snapped. I mean, it was clearly an amygdala hijack. What he said was, he didn't use that phrase, of course. What he said was, I just snapped. He said, there was this headbutt, and it reminded him when that happened, another fight, and he got an unfair call against him, and so he just let him have it. But what's fascinating is a report from a psychiatrist that examined Tyson. This report says Tyson demonstrated so-called executive control deficits. Now, that psychiatric jargon for a deficiency in these same prefrontal neurons, the just say no ones I was talking about a minute ago. These are the ones that let us reject an impulse. So from a psychiatric point of view, he had a deficiency in these neurons that inhibit impulse. From another point of view, actually, you could think that, well, maybe his amygdala got the wrong answer to that old question, do I eat it or does it eat me? So that's how the brain circuits that run between the amygdala and the prefrontal areas allow us to be intelligent about our emotions. When I talk about emotional intelligence, I'm referring to these brain circuits. Take self-awareness. That's the first part of emotional intelligence. Now, by self-awareness, what I actually mean is the ability to tell what we're feeling from moment to moment to moment. Now, it may seem pretty self-evident. We always know what we're feeling, right? But actually, we don't always know what we're feeling. Usually, we're caught in the stream of thought. We're thinking about what we're going to do tonight, all of the plans we have to make, what's on our to-do list, what we wish we had done that we haven't done, what to have on and on and on and on, right? But there's a stream of feeling that runs in perfect parallel to the stream of thoughts. We're always feeling something, right? Usually we don't notice it, though, until it kind of bubbles up and it crosses some threshold in perception, and then you see, oh, I'm getting a little nervous here, I'm getting a little irritated, whatever it may be. So we wait for our feelings to come to us, we don't go to them. So why should it matter that we notice what we're feeling from moment to moment? Well, for one, it's a basis for making sound decisions, surprisingly. Making decisions we can live with, things we're not going to regret down the road. I've got a friend, he was a physician, and a guy came to him with a business deal. Looked pretty good. It said if he'd give up his medical practice, invest $100,000 of his own money in this new business, a health resort, and become the medical director, in 3 years he would have $4 million. Looked really good, so he went for it. Well, one day he's driving down the road to his new job, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, he finds himself smashing the dashboard of his car, and he's yelling, I can't do this! I can't do this! And he pulls over to the side, calms himself down, gets composed, drives on to work. A year later, that business is bankrupt. So is he. When he told me about it later, he said, you know, I knew in my heart there was something wrong with that deal, but my head overruled my feelings. So listen to your gut feelings as well as your rational mind. Your intuitions are valuable information. Science tells us so. See, it has to do with how the brain is wired. Consider the case of a brilliant corporate lawyer. This is a man who unfortunately had a small prefrontal tumor, was operated on successfully, but during the course of the operation, they cut that connection between the amygdala, the emotional center, and the prefrontal lobes. Afterward, he seemed to be okay. There was no problem, no deficiency in his IQ or his memory or his attention, but something was wrong. He couldn't do his job anymore. He lost his job. He ended up out of work. His marriage fell apart. He lost his house. Ends up living in his brother's spare bedroom. So what does he do? He goes to this famous neurologist, Antonio Damasio, and he says, Doctor, what's wrong with me? And at first, this neurologist is completely puzzled, but because on all the tests, there's nothing wrong with the guy. Then one day, he gets a clue. He asks this lawyer, he says, when should we have our next appointment? And he realizes this lawyer can give him the rational pros and cons of every hour for the next 2 weeks, but he doesn't know which is best. In other words, this lawyer had no feelings about his thoughts, so he had no preferences. It was all the same to him. Now, Damasio argues that when we face a decision in life, should I marry this guy? Should I buy this house? Should I leave my job for another job? Damasio says the emotional brain summarizes the emotional bottom line, and it gives it to us as a gut feeling. It's actually a feeling in the body, in the gut. The neural tracts for this run into the intestines. So you get this felt body sense. It feels right, it doesn't feel right. That expression, this feels right, is literally true. In other words, hunches are important data. Now, it's not that we should throw out the facts. I'm not saying that. But we should give our hunches and intuitions their due. Remember, the amygdala and the prefrontal lobe, that is, our emotions and our intellect, they're partners in piloting us through life. So self-awareness is crucial for making good decisions in life. There are 4 more parts to emotional intelligence, each just as crucial. I'll tell you about them in a few moments. When we come back, I'll tell you a story that changed my life and just might change yours.
What an incredible program, and we'll be back with more of Daniel Goleman. You know, I find this so interesting.
About 2,500 years ago, the Greek philosopher Aristotle wrote, "Anyone can get angry, that's easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right purpose, and in the right way, not so easy, right? No easier now than it was then, because the design of the brain is the same. We have the amygdala, we have the prefrontal lobes, we've got hijacks. It's happening just like it was back then. Now, the root meaning of emotion, emote, means to move toward. Every emotion is an action plan for the body. It's an impulse to do something, maybe to run in fear, or to fight in anger, or attack, or cry when you're sad. So at the root of every emotion is an impulse. After self-awareness, the second emotional intelligence ability is handling our emotions, controlling these impulses. Now, the best study of this was actually done with 4-year-old kids. Let me tell you about it. It's called the marshmallow test. These are kids who were the children of professors and graduate students at Stanford. They're from the preschool. They're brought into a room one by one. They sit down at a table, and a big, juicy marshmallow is put right in front of them, right? And the experimenter says to them, "You can have this marshmallow now if you want, but if you'll wait till I run an errand and you don't eat it till I get back, you can have 2 then." Well, imagine. This is a predicament that tries the soul of any 4-year-old, I assure you. It's, sometimes they'll look away and try to pretend, this isn't happening, or they'll go off and sing and dance and try to distract themselves. One kid I saw went up to the marshmallow, smelled it, and then jumped back like it was some dangerous object. So they come up with stuff to try not to grab that marshmallow. Now, about a third of the kids did grab the marshmallow. They grabbed it right away and they ate it. Couldn't help it. This is good, right? On the other hand, about a third of kids waited out the endless 7 or 8 minutes until the experimenter gets back. You can imagine what that's like for a 4-year-old. They get 2 marshmallows. But the payoff from this experiment comes 14 years later, when these kids are tracked down just as they're graduating from high school. Amazing differences between the 2 groups. It's really surprising. If you compare the kids who grabbed to the kids who waited, now the ones who grabbed, by comparison, fall apart under stress. They're more easily irritated, more likely to get angry at friends, not very popular, still can't resist gratification in pursuit of their goals. The ones who waited, quite the opposite. They still are really stable under stress, pretty calm and collected, very popular, get along with people much better, still can keep their eye on the goal. But the really surprising, the shocking finding came when they compared their college entrance exam scores. It turns out that the kids who waited, compared to the kids who grabbed, had a 210-point advantage on their SATs, on the college entrance exam. Now that's 210 points out of 1,600. That is a staggering difference. It's whopping. Now I had a chance to go to Princeton and talk to the folks at the Educational Testing Service who make up that test. They were stunned. They said 210 points is as much as the difference between that we find in kids who come from families where parents have no high school education and families where the parents have a master's degree or better. It's enormous. So why should something as seemingly trivial as whether a kid can wait a few minutes for a marshmallow make such an immense difference in how they do intellectually? You know, the entrance exam, after all, is a test of how well children have learned. It goes back to how the brain is set up. Remember that link between the amygdala and the prefrontal lobe I was talking about a moment or two ago? The executive center and the emotional center. Well, the amygdala is the source of all emotional impulse. If you're a kid who's constantly in the grip of upsetting emotions, constantly antsy, you're preoccupied by distracting thoughts. Now, this is stuff you just can't keep off your mind. They're intrusive thoughts. And where they intrude is into your capacity for attention. And that happens to be based in the prefrontal lobes, the executive center. Now, the same thing is true, by the way, for adults in a high-stress job. This is why stress makes people do dumb things. These are things I regret later, right? Like little amygdala hijacks, sometimes big amygdala hijacks. But we can also change how we react, and we can change at any point in life. Okay, now we're at number 3, motivation. It's our emotions that move us toward our goals in life. Motivation is all about emotion. In reaching our goals, whatever they may be, optimism is extremely important. And that's because, you know, things never go smoothly in life. There's always a bump in the road, some obstacle, setback. Optimism comes into play when we have a setback or face some obstacle. The main difference between an optimist and a pessimist lies in what they tell themselves at these moments of setback. Like, okay, take a kid who gets a bad grade in math. The pessimists will tell themselves, gee, I guess this means I'm dumb at math. So they'll give up, right? Now, an optimistic kid gets this same bad grade, he'll tell himself something completely different. He'll say, oh, I guess I should have studied harder for the test, right? In other words, the optimist sees it as due to something in the circumstance that they can change for the better. The pessimist sees it as a fatal flaw in themselves that just can't be changed. So being an optimist matters immensely for how we do in life. The good news about emotional intelligence is that it's all learned, too. If you're a pessimist, you don't have to stay that way. You can learn to think like an optimist. The 4th emotional intelligence ability is empathy. And by empathy, I mean knowing what someone is feeling without their telling you in words. Because you know what? People don't tell us in words what they're feeling, do they? They tell us in their tone of voice, facial expression, their movements, all these nonverbal cues. Empathy is crucial to getting along with people. And it's the basis of caring and compassion. You see, you can spot the roots of empathy very early in life, even in infants. Sometimes you'll be holding a baby who hears another baby crying and starts crying in sympathy. It's called sympathetic distress. That's already empathy. The baby is responding to how someone else is feeling. And if you pick her up when she's crying and you soothe her, you're teaching her that one person can know how another one feels. That's a lesson in empathy. You know how you feel and you respond appropriately. So kids start to learn this very early. And the more the brain experiences something, the stronger that circuitry becomes. So when you pick up a crying baby and soothe her, that's an important lesson in empathy. It seems like such a simple thing, but it really matters. Now, a childhood of lessons like that strengthens the child's brain circuitry for sensing how other people are feeling ordinarily. If a kid is well-loved and well-nurtured, by age 3, a toddler, you see if they're playing with another kid and that friend falls down and hurts himself, most 3-year-olds will just spontaneously try to make him feel better. They'll go bring him their blankie or go get their mommy to try to make him feel better. That's the way kids ordinarily are. But in children who are abused or neglected by that age, you see something very different, and it's very troubling. These kids don't go over and try to make their friend feel better. They go over and they order them to stop, And if their friend doesn't stop, they'll get really angry at them. They'll start yelling at them. And if they still don't stop, they'll hit them. It's really a tragic thing. They've already started to treat others the way they were treated. Now, an absence in empathy is really disturbing. I have a brother-in-law. He's a writer, and as it happens, an expert on horror and terror. Now, actually, he's a Chaucer scholar by training and a really nice guy, but he was born in Transylvania. He was. And somehow I think it affected him. At one point, he wanted to write a book about this man who was a serial killer. He was called the Santa Cruz Strangler. Before he was arrested, he had murdered 5 co-eds at UC San Diego, his own mother and his grandparents. Very scary guy. For one thing, he's almost 7 feet tall. But actually, that's not the scariest thing about him. You want to know what's really scary about him? His IQ is 160. He's a certified genius. But that's the point. There is zero relationship between IQ and empathy. The neurons for empathy, the neurons for recognizing emotion in another person are in the amygdala. It's in the emotional brain, not in the thinking brain. So anyhow, after hours and hours of interviewing this strangler, my brother-in-law finally gets up the courage to ask him the one question he's been dying to know. He says, "How could you have done it? Didn't you feel any pity for the people that you murdered?" And the strangler says very matter-of-factly, "Oh no, if I felt any of their distress, I couldn't have done it." He didn't feel any of their distress. I couldn't have done it. That's just the point. Empathy is what keeps people from harming others. When we feel with someone, we want to help them. If our own amygdala is too busy with its own little hijack, you're not going to be that clear channel. You won't be able to empathize. And when we empathize with someone, we feel their distress, and so we want to help them. Okay, now for number 5. The 5th part of emotional intelligence boils down to handling emotions in other people. It's the art of relationships. In every exchange, we can make each other feel a little better or a little worse, or a lot better or a lot worse. Every interaction can be related along this dimension of nourishing to toxic. You see, emotions are contagious. Emotions pass between us as part of every interaction. People who are really adept at social skill, they know this. They use it to make things better. Now I'm going to tell you the story that changed my life. It showed me we're all part of each other's emotional toolkit, for better or for worse. It was a really hot, horrible, humid day in New York City, and everybody's walking around in a kind of a bubble that says, "Don't touch me, don't talk to me, leave me alone. I'm a little prickly and irritable today." And I'm waiting for the bus with my bubble intact, and pulls up, and I get on, careful to bring my bubble with me, and the bus driver does something really surprising. He talks to me. He says, "Hi, how you doing? It's great to have you on the bus." He really means it. I'm shocked. I sit down, and all of a sudden I realize this guy's carrying on a dialogue with the whole bus. "Oh, you're looking for suits, are you? You know this department store down here on the right, it's got a great sale on suits. You should check it out. Hey, did you hear about this great Picasso show at the museum down here?" On and on and on. People get off the bus and he'd say, "Well, so long, it's been great having you." And they say, "Yeah, it's been great being on this bus." That man was an urban saint. He was sending ripples of good feeling throughout the city. When I saw him, I realized we all have this power to make each other feel better or worse. And we have this power no matter what we do, because it's how we do it that makes the difference. Let me tell you about several ways all this makes a big difference in our lives. For one, being intelligent about our emotions, science is now finding, is good for our health. That's right, good for health. Some of the strongest links between the brain and the body are between the emotional centers and the immune system, and the emotional centers and the cardiovascular system. That means our emotions have a major impact on, say, our resistance to colds and viruses or our susceptibility to heart disease. In fact, there was an analysis of more than 100 studies that looked at people's emotional states, their habitual emotional states and their health, and they found that people who are chronically distressed, who are chronically pessimistic or irritable or stressed out and anxious and so on, have double the risk of developing a major disease. And this is major diseases of all kinds. Double the risk is quite an amazing statistic because it's as big as the health risk factor for smoking. So one key to handling stress in your life, to handling it better, is giving yourself ways to recover, ways to kind of calm down from whatever's upsetting you. See, stress isn't really so much in the things that happen in your life. It's really in how we react to them. And we can do something about those reactions. There are 3 windows of opportunity when it comes to handling the stress in our lives. The first is to do something to change things for the better. You know, whatever's the cause of the stress, if you can change it, do it. The second is in how you see it, changing the way you perceive what's happening. I once heard a wonderful line from a television preacher. It goes like this: something good is going to happen to you today. I love that line. That is so great. You don't know what it is. It's a wonderful thought because it allows the possibility that what may seem so bad at first has an upside, that there's a silver lining to that cloud, right? Now, if we can't change the things that are happening to us and we can't change how we see it, then we're left with a third opportunity, and that's handling the way our body and our mind react to these things. See, when the body is stressed, the emotional centers flood the body with stress hormones, and this makes it do things like shunt blood from the arms and the legs into the organs. It's a fight or flight response. It pumps up our blood pressure, speeds up our heartbeat. It steals energy, actually, from the immune system, it turns out, to get us ready for an emergency. It's what's called the fight or flight response. You've heard about that. Now, if that response gets triggered day after day, week after week, and month after month, over years, what happens is the biological system in our body that's most susceptible genetically, that's most reactive, is going to start to develop a stress-caused disease. You know, if you're a cardiovascular reactor, you're going to get high blood pressure. If you react in your gut, you're going to get problems there, and so on throughout the body. That's how stress over years and years leads to disease. It speeds up the process of coming down with the disease. So constant stress, it's like getting your amygdala stuck in high gear. Continual hijacks. We need to calm down. That's where relaxation comes in. Now, a relaxation method I've been using for years is a very simple meditation. What I do is every morning I spend about 20 minutes or so just in a quiet place and just being aware of my breath. I just focus on my breath. And when some other thoughts come up, if they're distracting, something I'm worrying about, I just let it go. I go back to my breath. You can use a simple prayer in the same way. In fact, you can use any positive word as a point of focus. Anything that has positive meaning for you will work in the same way. Or if that doesn't appeal to you, if you like aerobic exercise, it'll do the same thing. It works as a relaxer. It turns out that after you've had your workout and you're all pumped up, your body gets more relaxed than it was before you started out. So it ends up doing the same thing. But having a daily period where you take the time by yourself to be calm and relaxed will pay off in dealing better with the stresses in your day. And that means better health. Now, when we come back, I'll share with you some practical tips on how to make emotional intelligence work for you. Now let's look at how emotional intelligence matters for our relationships, for our friendships, our marriage, for family life. Starts out like this. One of the partners has a grievance, something on their chest they just want to get off their chest. Now, they do it in the wrong way. Now, let's say it's the wife, okay? She does not wait for a moment when this couple is feeling cozy and close and then take that opportunity to tell her husband, oh, you know, dear, when you leave your dirty clothes on the bedroom floor for me to pick up, it makes me feel like you don't respect me or something. So I'd really feel better, dear, if you would take your dirty clothes and put them in the laundry yourself. She doesn't do that. Instead, she waits till she's really steamed up. She's really burning, amygdala hijacking her like crazy. And she says, you are the biggest slob I have ever seen, right? Now, that's not an effective critique. It's a character attack. And what do you do when you're attacked? Well, it's only natural. You defend yourself, right? So he makes some lame excuse like, well, I picked him up last week. Well, maybe just my socks, but still, okay. Or he counterattacks. But you leave the dishes in the sink for me to clean up, right? Well, it only makes it worse because no matter what he says, counterattack, lame excuse, it's not satisfying because when you have a complaint, what you want is to be heard. The person making the complaint wants to feel understood. So if you don't feel heard, the natural next step is to up the volume. You up the volume emotionally by adding two very powerful emotions to the message. One is contempt, and the other is disgust. You know, it's the sarcasm, the sneer, right? Rolling your eyes, oh man. That's how you do it. It turns out these are especially hurtful messages from someone you love. When people are at the receiving end of disgust or contempt in these interactions, their heart rate can jump 30 or 40 beats per minute in a single heartbeat. Man, that is a huge amygdala hijack. People say it's like being swamped, having this overwhelming feeling they would do anything to escape. So that leads to the final round, and that final round is stonewalling. He just goes blank, like pretending this is not happening. If they're back home, it might be going back to reading the newspaper or watching TV, tuning her out completely, leaving the room. Now, luckily, in most healthy relationships, people go down that path a little ways, but then one or the other partners de-escalates, or the couple, maybe they've learned to take a break when they're both having an amygdala hijack. So they might go off and do something to cool down, or come back later together so they can talk about it more. Now, that would be great. Now, not every couple could do that, right? So at least you might try to realize when you're having that amygdala hijack. You got to give the hijack time to pass. You have to let the prefrontal lobes, that's your rational intellect, have a voice. Now, we've seen how repeated amygdala hijacks can destroy a marriage. The same things go on in relationships at work. It's just like a married couple, and it's just as destructive. Let me tell you about a guy named Melbourne McBroom. Very interesting character. He was an awful boss. This is a guy whose temper was so bad it intimidated all his employees. Now, if he had worked in an office, we would never have known about McBroom, except he was an airplane pilot. One day, McBroom is piloting a plane into Portland when he notices a problem in a landing gear. So McBroom begins fiddling and fiddling with this problem, and the plane is circling Portland. And while he's obsessing, his co-pilots are saying nothing because they're so scared of his temper. But their fuel gauges are getting lower and lower and lower. They never said a word. That plane crashed, killed 10 people. Today, that cockpit tape is used in training pilots because one estimate says that up to 90% of airplane crashes could be prevented if the crew were able to communicate better, if they could work together more harmoniously. Now, the cockpit of a plane is like a microcosm of a company. Miserable morale, intimidated workers, arrogant bosses, right? They can make a company go down in flames in just the same way. Open and clear communication is as essential at work as in marriage. Pick a moment when you're not being hijacked, for starters, right? Find a time to bring it up when you're not upset, and be specific. Tell them exactly what they're doing wrong. Give them an idea of what they can do right, how to be more effective. That way, you're not going to hijack them. Maybe they'll really hear it if you follow that. And remember, your goal isn't to prove you're right and they're wrong. It's to work better together. And to work well together, what do we need? Emotional intelligence. Now, we do need it, but there might be less of it to go around in a little while. And the bad news about emotional intelligence is that children seem to be losing it. They seem to be declining. There's a national problem. The best data comes from a random sample of more than 2,000 kids across the country. These are kids that were rated by their parents and teachers, grown-ups who knew them really well. It was done twice, a decade and a half apart. And over that decade and a half, America's children showed a steep decline. Now, it isn't that there still aren't terrific kids. Of course, there are great kids. But on average, something is going wrong. They were more anxious and depressed, more disobedient and lonely, more angry. They went down on 42 measures of emotional intelligence. They didn't go up on one. Now, that's a mammoth change. I believe, you know, those headlines we've been seeing lately about how younger and younger kids are committing murders, or those horrible shootings of other kids in the schools, that's just the tip of the iceberg. That's why I've become an advocate of courses in emotional literacy. I think it's important to teach these skills in school. We've got to be sure every child gets these proper lessons for life. Now, the good news about emotional intelligence is that it's learned. That's unlike IQ, which doesn't change through life. These abilities can be mastered at any point. The brain, it turns out, is the last organ of the body to become fully mature anatomically. You know, it continues to grow long after we're born. And the centers that regulate emotion are among the last part of the brain to become anatomically mature. They don't take their final shape until around, I don't know, age 14 or 15, if you can believe that. The way the brain shapes itself is through repeated experiences. The more we experience something, the stronger the underlying circuitry for it becomes. So we can help our children actually train their emotional circuitry for the better. Now, some people claim that parents don't matter when it comes to how their children turn out. It's just not true. You are your child's main emotional tutor. Parents matter very much. If you realize your child is learning such key lessons from you, it gives you a very different way to look at those moments when your child's upset. These, you'll see, are opportunities to teach a little lesson in emotional intelligence. Say, for example, a 10-year-old girl comes in and she's crying because her friends wouldn't play with her. It's common melodrama at that age. Well, what you might do is point out to her that she got hurt and then she got angry and now she's upset. And that helps her learn how one emotion leads to another, builds self-awareness. Then you could find ways to help her calm down. You might, for example, recommend, you know, dear, why don't you go off and play with a favorite toy of yours for a while. Then when you feel better, come on back and we'll talk about it. So that helps her understand ways that she can make herself feel better. And then when you do come back together, you can brainstorm with her. It's a third thing you can do. Think of ways that you can solve this little social problem you're having. So maybe find something that's really fun that everybody would enjoy doing. So that's another lesson in emotional intelligence. And teaching kids these basic lessons in emotional intelligence has real payoff. But then again, there are costs when kids lack the fundamentals too. Let me tell you about some. 4th and 5th grade girls who confuse the feelings of worry and anxiety and loneliness and hunger start to binge when they're upset. These are the girls, if you follow them through the teen years, most at risk for eating disorders. If you look at second and third grade boys who are most antsy and impulsive and disruptive and so on, you follow them through their teen years, they have 3 to 6 times the likelihood of being violent or getting arrested as other kids. Now, if you look at impulsive girls from third grade on, they don't get violent, they get pregnant at 3 times the rate of other girls. Schoolyard bullies, this is an interesting one. It turns out they have a deficiency in empathy. They misinterpret neutral faces as hostile ones. So they see themselves as surrounded by kids that are against them. They don't think of themselves as picking on the kids. They see themselves as defending themselves. But kids can learn these basic skills if we bother to teach them. Schools across the country have started to teach emotional intelligence as part of the regular curriculum. One of the great success stories is in New Haven, Connecticut. This is a place where every one of the 19,000 kids in that town gets a class in what they call social development. It starts in the earliest years, it goes through high school. Now, I've sat in those classrooms and I've watched, and one of my very favorite things is on the wall in each of the classrooms, it's a stoplight. It's a red light, yellow light, green light. And it says, whenever you're upset, whenever you're going to do something that might get you in trouble, remember the stoplight. Red light, stop, calm down, and think before you act. Well, what's stop? Stop is impulse control. Calm down is managing your feelings. And think before you act teaches the crucial lesson about emotions, which is you can't control what you're going to feel or when you're going to feel it or how strong it's going to be, but you do have a choice point, and that's how you react once you feel that way. Then there's a yellow light. Think of a whole bunch of different things you could do and what the consequences of each one is going to be. And then green light, pick the best one, try it out. I tried this myself. It's pretty good advice, actually. Recommend it. And it makes a big difference in the schools where good programs are being taught. Kids in those schools, they not only get more emotionally intelligent, they have fewer problems like fights or substance abuse or dropouts, things like that. And very interestingly, the kids in these schools have higher achievement test scores because they can pay attention, they can learn. Their amygdala's not going crazy on them. Now, you're really lucky if you learn these skills as a kid. But remember, you can improve emotional intelligence at any point in life. One of the fundamental skills is handling an amygdala hijack. Now, if you feel you need to get better at it, and who doesn't? Good news is you can. There are 5 simple steps. Number 1, watch yourself. At first, just try to notice, when your temper flares up, what are the situations that trigger it? Who sets you off? Just keep track for about a week, okay? Number 2, find a model. Just watch someone who you know who handles similar situations without flying off the handle. If you can ask them about it, ask them. And practice in your mind handling anger or hijacks the way this person does, the way your model does. Number 3, notice the signals in your body that tell you when your anger is starting to build up. Maybe your stomach tightens up. Maybe your brow furrows. Maybe you start feeling tense in your body. Doesn't matter what it is, just start to notice it. Get familiar with it. Number 4, short-circuit the hijack the moment you see it starting to build. Now, this is a crucial step. Once you know how to spot this anger or hijack building up in you, there are many ways you can cool down at that moment. You can count to 10. You've heard that 100 times. Actually works. Take a time out if you can. Ask yourself, does this really have to be dealt with at this minute? Can it wait until you cool down? One of the most useful phrases I ever learned was, I'll think about it. Try it. Or just remind yourself, blowing up isn't going to help. Number 5, repeat these steps at every opportunity. And here's an important one, too. You blow it, hey, forgive yourself. You're going to slip backward. Just be sure you use that relapse as an opportunity how to learn to do it better next time. What can you learn from that? Let me end with a story about a friend of mine. His name's Terry Dobson. When Terry was a young man, he was a really tough guy. He was a U.S. Marine. And his idea of a good time was to go into a bar, get drunk, and pick a fight. That's the kind of guy he was. He's actually a direct descendant of Daniel Boone, real tough kind of guy. Well, Terry was a U.S. Marine, but he got out of the service, and he found himself in Japan, and he became one of the first American students of a man who was a teacher of a martial art called Aikido. One day, after he's been working out all day, he's on one of these jammed Tokyo trains going out to the suburbs where he lives. And at one stop, this man gets on, a huge, kind of dirty laborer, looks like, very, very drunk. And this drunk guy starts flailing around on the train, knocks over a pregnant woman. Now, Japan is a very decorous society. This kind of stuff just never happens, right? So everybody on that train is trying to get it away from this guy down to the other end of the train. Happens that Terry's at the other end of the train. Terry is secretly delighted. This is the big moment he's been waiting for. So he stands up very slowly and deliberately. He's about a foot taller than everyone else on the train. So the drunk spots him. He says, "Oh, a foreigner. You need a lesson in Japanese manners." It's like high noon there on the train car. So as this drunk is staggering down the train toward Terry, all of a sudden a little old Japanese man in a kimono who's sitting in a seat to the side pipes up. He says to this drunk, "Hey, what you been drinking?" And he says it in the most friendly tone, like he's known this guy all his life. This drunk is kind of astonished. He says, "Sake, what's it to you?" This old man is completely undeterred. He says, "Oh, sake, you know, my wife and I, we just love sake. Every night we'll warm up some sake and take it outside in our backyard and sit under our favorite persimmon tree and talk over the events of the day. And do you do anything like that?" All of a sudden, this drunk's face just changes completely. He says, "No. My wife, she died 3 years ago. I don't have a wife. I don't have a job. I don't have a home. I'm so ashamed of myself." At that, the old man says, "Oh, you poor thing. Come sit here next to me. Tell me about it." And the drunk sits down, and just then the train gets to Terry's stop, and he looks over. He sees, well, it looks like it's okay to leave. And as he's leaving, he looks back, and there is the drunk with his head in the old man's lap, just sobbing. That's emotional brilliance. Imagine if that could happen on the streets of Chicago or Houston or your town. Learning it and practicing it can change your life. Thank you all.
And we want to remind you that if you'd like to further your enjoyment of the program that you've been watching, we would be delighted to send you a VH copy of Emotional Intelligence, yours for a membership pledge of $80. If you'd like the soft cover book, Emotional Intelligence, we'd also be delighted to send you that for a pledge of $60. This has been an incredible and thought-provoking program. If you have appreciated the message that Daniel Goleman has brought to us, then please show it with your pledge right now. 1-800-492-1111.